let's explore the mind of a necessary monster, a man shaped by the very society he served.
You see, this was the executioner's paradox, a role of just impossible contradiction. To get him, you first have to get his world. It was all stark, moral absolutes. In this world, he was the hand of justice, but he lived completely outside of society. And that contradiction, it forged his mind in a deep, inescapable social void. So what did that actually feel like? I mean, to be a ghost among the living. Imagine a life of constant public shame. Shopkeepers wouldn't even take coins from his hand. But here's the thing. This isolation, it wasn't an accident. It was a prerequisite. See, society projected all its guilt for state-sanctioned killing right onto this one guy. He became a kind of sin eater, literally absorbing the moral filth of the community.
And this let everyone else, the citizens, the judges, feel pure. Their hands were clean.
Because if he was just a man doing a job, what did that say about them? So to take this job meant choosing a life of psychological exile, plain and simple. His very survival depended on cutting off that fundamental need for social acceptance. To survive all that hate and fear, his mind had to become a fortress. But this fortress wasn't to keep others out. It was to survive being locked out. And that's the key, right? His most profound trial wasn't actually lifting the axe.
It was the crushing weight of being utterly and unnecessarily alone.
I mean, how could anyone's mind possibly handle a job like that? Because, let's be honest, the emotional burden was just completely unsustainable. The solution was a surprisingly sophisticated mental architecture, built just for this.
And the first part of this architecture was the most visible one, the executioner's hood.
But here's the thing. It wasn't for disguise. In a small town, everybody knew him.
Instead, it was like a psychological switch, a ritual that signaled a total identity shift. This really shows you that stark mental split between the person and the role they played. So the hood created a physical boundary for a necessary psychological break. Now for the second tool, which built on this idea, highly structured ritual. You see, the whole thing was treated like a scripted performance, not just an act. Every single step was rigidly scripted, which removed the need for personal thought. He wasn't making a choice, he was just following the next step in the procedure. And just like that, he became less of a person and more of a functionary. The final tool was a powerful psychological shield, the specific language that was used. The victim wasn't a person anymore. They were the condemned. It's a way to create distance. He wasn't taking a life. No, he was performing the sentence. See the difference? This let him see the person as a task, not as another human being. So when you put it all together, these three tools create a blueprint for detachment. So, to recap, the hood for transformation, the ritual for procedure, and language as a shield. And for those few crucial moments, he became the unfeeling instrument society needed him to be. You see, this wasn't some hidden act. It was a brutal lesson in obedience for everyone. The whole idea, it was basically a grim morality play, and the scaffold was its stage. And the lead actor in this gruesome play, the executioner, he was a performer, judged by everyone. His performance had one single job, to show the terrifying absolute power of the king. And to send that message, his performance had to be perfect. A clean, single strike was the goal. It wasn't just about being efficient, though. A clean cut symbolized the king's inescapable justice. Get this, a clean execution was even seen as a sign that the sentence itself was righteous. But, like any live show, things could go one of two ways, perfectly or terribly wrong. A botched execution, that was an absolute disaster. The whole message could spectacularly backfire. Instead of a solemn spectacle, you'd just get messy, chaotic butchery. Not a good look. Suddenly, the crowd's terror could just flip into pity and then into outright rage. It was a crazy domino effect. One single mistake could literally spark a full-blown riot. So can you imagine the performance anxiety? He had to be an expert and look totally calm. All this pressure created a really dark and strange kind of celebrity. Everybody knew his name. People whispered stories about his skill and coldness. He was this terrifying, compelling figure. He was a monster, for sure, but he was their monster. It's a huge paradox, right? So this guy was a master of a dark craft, despised by many, but also a celebrity. I mean, he was the star of the town's biggest events. The entire social order depended on him. When you picture an executioner, you probably imagine one big, dramatic moment on the scaffold, right?
But their reality was a lot darker, and the worst parts happened far from any public eye.
So what does that really mean?
Well, for starters, his first hidden role was as the state's torturer.
And let me tell you, that job required a whole different kind of psychological fortitude.
See, torture wasn't quick. It was a long, intimate process. You had to completely detach emotionally.
He basically had to become an expert in pain, knowing exactly how far the human body could be pushed.
This created a really twisted kind of intimacy, a huge psychological weight to carry.
And his job didn't stop there. His connection to death was also, well, very hands-on.
He was the guy who handled all the dirty work no one else would even dream of touching.
So his whole life, even his home, was steeped in the actual smell of death and decay.
He was kind of stuck, living right on the threshold between the world of the living and the dead.
And get this, all that horror, all that work was boiled down to simple economics.
Yep, every single act of violence, from a hanging to something much worse, had a price tag.
This was blood money, literally. It's how he survived, but it's also what made him a pariah.
So the coins he earned were a constant reminder that his family was profiting from suffering.
You can really see the two sides here, the public myth versus the absolutely grim private reality.
So the real test, his true crucible, wasn't just one spectacular moment of violence. No, it was a lifetime of being society's professional outcast. It defined his entire existence.
So what really happens to a mind that lives a life of state-sanctioned violence?
You see, his mind was a battleground, making him a prime candidate for what we now call PTSD. It's a modern diagnosis, sure, but it gives us a real framework to understand his historical suffering.
But in his time, these weren't symptoms. They were just a grim, everyday part of the job.
He had to kill his own empathy just to do the work. But you can't just flip that switch off at home.
So, true intimacy with his own family? It became difficult, maybe even impossible.
This trauma led to this deep feeling of being, well, irrevocably stained.
It's this sense of being totally different, tainted by his actions, breaking a huge human taboo.
And this created a huge paradox. He was an agent of the state, but also a social outcast.
His work, meant to purge sin from others, ended up saturating his own soul with it. And maybe the most tragic part? This psychological stain, it was hereditary.
You see, it was an inescapable cycle. The role was passed down not out of choice, but pure necessity.
The son was already trapped by his father's job, killing that universal hope for a better life.
Instead of honor, a father saw his legacy as just a continuation of his own damnation.
So the executioner becomes this man trapped, a necessary tool that society both needed and hated.
He was a dark mirror, really, reflecting the true hidden price of keeping order.
He became a psychological scar on the society that both created and condemned him.
So you have to ask, who really bears the scar for a society's justice?